3 years of silence. That's how long Dean Martin had vanished from the world. No interviews, no stages, no laughter drifting out of a nightclub at 2 in the morning. His son was gone. His voice was gone. The Rat Pack, once inseparable, was scattered like ashes in the wind. And then, on May 18th, 1990, Dean Martin stepped back into the light for one reason only: to bury his brother. What happened in those final minutes of Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral was something no one present ever forgot, because it was the first time anyone saw the King of Cool completely collapse. It was a bright Thursday morning in Beverly Hills, the kind of cruelly beautiful day that feels offensive when the world is mourning. Forest Lawn Memorial Park filled early with black suits, dark sunglasses, and quiet sobs. Movie stars, musicians, politicians, legends, they were all there to say goodbye to Sammy Davis Jr., the man who danced like fire, sang like soul itself, and endured a lifetime of pain behind a fearless smile. But there was one name whispered through the crowd with disbelief: Dean Martin. No one expected him to come. Since March 21st, 1987, the night his son Dean Paul died in a fighter jet crash, Dean Martin had disappeared. The man who once owned Las Vegas, who traded insults and laughter with Sinatra and Sammy, who made millions fall in love with that some more, had simply stopped existing in public. Offers poured in. Vegas begged. Television executives pleaded. Frank called again and again. Dean said no every time. He stopped singing. He stopped performing. Some said he stopped living. When Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990, after a brutal fight with throat cancer, the entertainment world froze. Frank Sinatra took charge immediately, calling everyone who mattered: Liza Minnelli, Quincy Jones, Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson. Then he dialed the one number he feared most. When Dean finally picked up, there was nothing but heavy breathing on the line. "Dino," Frank said, his voice cracking. "Sammy's gone. The funeral's Thursday. I need you there, pal." Silence. Then Dean spoke, barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can bury another brother." Frank pleaded, begged. "Please, he love it. He'd want you there." Another long pause. Then Dean said something that chilled Frank to the bone. "When I lost my boy, I lost my heart. When I lost Sammy, I lost in my soul. I don't know what's left of me to bring." Frank had no answer, but he knew Dean would come. He had to. The morning of the funeral, Dean's housekeeper found him standing in his closet, staring at his suits like they belonged to another man. He'd lost so much weight, nothing fit properly. His hands trembled as he pulled out the same black suit he'd worn to his son's funeral 3 years earlier. When she asked if he was sure, he didn't look at her. He just nodded. "I owe him that much." When Dean arrived at Forest Lawn, a hush moved through the crowd like a ripple in water. He looked frail, smaller. The swagger was gone. The smile was gone. Even Frank was startled when he saw him. Dean moved slowly, as if every step required permission from his own body. He took his seat in the front row, beside Sinatra. For a long time, neither man spoke. The service was beautiful and unbearable. Stevie Wonder sang through tears. Speakers talked about Sammy's genius, his courage, his humor, his fight. The crowd laughed softly at stories, then cried harder at the truth beneath them. Dean sat perfectly still, hands clasped, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. He hadn't cried yet. He hadn't moved. Then came the final moment. The casket was carried forward. The honor guard stood at attention, and suddenly the weight of it all broke through whatever wall Dean had built. He leaned forward, shoulders shaking. Frank reached for him instinctively, but it was too late. Dean let out a sound no one had ever heard from him before. Not a sob, not a cry, a broken animal moan pulled straight from the deepest place of grief. He bent over completely, clutching his chest, gasping like a man drowning in open air. The crowd froze. This wasn't Dean Martin performing grief. This wasn't cool. This wasn't controlled. This was a man who had lost everything he loved and was being forced to bury it again. Frank wrapped his arms around him. Liza Minnelli began to cry openly. Even hardened men who had seen death their entire lives looked away, unable to watch. Dean whispered through tears, over and over, "I can't lose another one. I can't." For decades, Dean Martin had made the world believe nothing touched him, that he left everything off, that pain slid right past him. But in that moment, the illusion shattered. The king of cool was gone. What stood in his place was a broken brother, a broken father, a man who had outlived the people who gave his life meaning. When the service ended, Dean didn't stay. He didn't talk to reporters. He didn't accept condolences. Frank walked him to the car, his arm around him like a shield. Dean never attended another public funeral. He never performed again. That day at Forest Lawn was the last time the world saw him as anything other than a memory. People who were there would later say that Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral wasn't just a goodbye to Sammy. It was the moment Dean Martin truly died in public. The body kept going for a few more years. The legend survived on television and vinyl, but the man himself never recovered. Dean Martin once sang that everybody loves somebody sometime. On that bright morning in Beverly Hills, the world saw the truth behind the song. Dean Martin had loved deeply, and when those people were taken from him, there was nothing left for the performance to hide. She noticed how frail he had become. The man who once filled rooms without trying, who moved with effortless swagger and sleepy confidence, now looked as if a strong breeze might knock him over. His frame had collapsed inward. His face was hollowed out, cheeks, sunken skin, stretched thin. The king of cool had not aged, he had withered. When Dean Martin's car pulled up to Forest Lawn Memorial Park, the illusion of privacy vanished instantly. Photographers rushed forward, flashes exploding like gunfire. Reporters shouted his name, desperate for a quote. 3 years. That's how long it had been since anyone had seen him in public. Dean didn't acknowledge the chaos. His bodyguard, Marcus, stayed close, one hand hovering near Dean's arm as if ready to catch him if he fell. "Mr. Martin," a reporter yelled, pushing past the others, "how are you feeling today?" Dean stopped just for a second. He turned slowly, eyes dull but sharp at the same time, eyes that had buried a son and now stood on the edge of burying a brother. "How do you think I'm feeling?" he whispered. No anger, no drama, just truth. Then he turned away and kept walking. Inside the chapel, the air felt heavy, almost unbreathable. 500 people filled the space, every row packed. Black suits, dark dresses, sunglasses indoors. Hollywood royalty shoulder to shoulder with civil rights leaders and musicians who owed their careers to the man in the casket. But when Dean Martin entered, the room paused. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward. "Is that Dean Martin? I didn't think he'd come. He looks broken." Dean either didn't hear it or no longer cared. He moved quietly toward the back row, as far from the casket as he could get. He didn't want eyes on him. He didn't want sympathy. He just wanted to be present, invisible. A brother saying goodbye in silence. Frank Sinatra stood near the casket at the front. When he saw Dean, their eyes met across the room. For a brief moment, Frank's composure cracked. His mouth tightened. His eyes softened. Nada duanes. Dean nodded back. No words were exchanged. They didn't need them. 40 years of shared life had taught them how to speak without sound. The service began. Reverend Jesse Jackson stepped forward, his voice steady and resonant. He spoke of Sammy's brilliance, his courage, his fight against racism, his refusal to be diminished by hatred. The words were powerful, necessary. But to Dean, they felt distant, like they were coming from another world. Everything did. Now Stevie Wonder sang Ribbon in the Sky. His voice floated through the chapel, pure and aching, and people began to cry openly. Hands went to mouths. Heads bowed. Shoulders shook. Dean sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, face unreadable. The mask was still there. The last thin layer of cool holding everything together. Liza Minnelli followed. She barely made it through her remarks. She spoke of Sammy as a protector, a mentor, a man who lifted her when she was breaking. She laughed through tears, then dissolved into them. The room wept with her. Dean didn't move. Then Frank Sinatra walked to the podium. He looked older than his years. He gripped the sides of the lectern as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He glanced down at his notes, then pushed them aside. His voice, when it came, was low and trembling. Sammy Davis Jr. was the greatest entertainer who ever lived, Frank said. But more than that, he was my friend, my brother, my family. He paused, swallowing hard. The three of us, me, Sammy, and Dino, we did everything together. We owned Vegas. We made movies. We laughed too hard. We drank too much. We thought we were untouchable. A weak, broken smile crossed Frank's face. And, for a while, we were. His eyes lifted and found Dean in the back row. Dean felt the weight of that look, but couldn't bring himself to return it. But time touches everyone, Frank continued. Loss breaks even the strongest of us. Frank's voice cracked. He steadied himself and went on. Sammy used to tell me, Charlie, when I go, don't you dare cry for me. I lived 10 lifetimes. In one, if I die tomorrow, I'll die happy. Frank stopped. His shoulders began to shake. Well, you son of a gun. You did. You lived. And then Frank Sinatra broke. Right there at the podium, in front of 500 people. The man who had stared down presidents and mob bosses bowed his head and cried. That was when something inside Dean Martin finally gave way. The mask didn't slip. It shattered. Dean leaned forward, clutching the pew in front of him as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. A sound escaped him that no one had ever heard before. Not a sob, not a cry. Something deeper, something primal. Grief ripped straight out of his chest. His shoulders collapsed inward. His head dropped. The king a cool, folded in on himself like man whose spine had been removed. Frank saw it and stepped away from the podium without thinking. He crossed the aisle and wrapped his arms around Dean, holding him as Dean shook, whispering over and over, "I can't lose another one. I can't." People in the chapel looked away, not out of indifference, but because the moment was too intimate to witness. This wasn't a celebrity breaking down. This was a man who had outlived the people who gave his life meaning. When the service ended, Dean didn't linger. He didn't accept condolences. He didn't speak to the press. Frank walked him out, arm around his shoulders, steadying him like a brother should. That day was the last time the world ever saw Dean Martin in public. After that funeral, the body kept going for a few more years. The legend lived on in reruns and vinyl and memory, but the man himself never truly stood up again. At Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral, Dean Martin didn't just say goodbye to a friend. He finally let the world see what he had been carrying all along. And once it was visible, there was no putting it back. His voice cracked, and that alone sent a shiver through the crowd. Dean Martin did not crack. He didn't bend. He didn't show weakness. That was the rule. That was the myth. And now the myth was breaking in real time. "You said we were immortal," Dean whispered, staring into the open grave. "You said the music would keep us alive." His hands trembled at his sides. "You were wrong, pal." The music stops. The lights go out. And the silence. The silence is louder than any applause we ever got. Frank stood a step behind him, watching, knowing better than to interrupt. The entire cemetery had gone still. No cameras clicked. No one spoke. It felt less like a funeral and more like a confession being pulled out of a man who had spent his entire life hiding behind charm and jokes. Dean swallowed hard. "First, my boy," he said, his voice breaking completely now. No mask left to protect him. "Then, you." They don't tell you that part. They don't tell you that the real punishment for living too long is watching everyone you love leave before you. He knelt down slowly, ignoring the murmurs of concern, ignoring the hands that reached out to steady him. He picked up a single white rose, its petals perfect and unbroken. "You always landed on your feet, Smokey," Dean said, forcing a weak smile that collapsed as quickly as it formed. "You danced through hell and made it look easy. If anyone deserved a soft landing, it was you." He dropped the rose into the grave and watched it disappear. "Save me a seat," he added quietly. "I'm tired." That was it. No speech, no performance, no goodbye fit for headlines. Just a man talking to the last brother he had left in the world. Dean stood back up, visibly exhausted, as if those few sentences had taken years off his life. Frank stepped in then, wrapping an arm around him, holding him up. Dean didn't resist. He leaned into Frank, finally allowing himself to be carried instead of carrying everything alone. As the crowd slowly dispersed, whispers followed them. Not gossip, not awe. Something closer to reverence. People had come expecting to mourn Sammy Davis Jr. They left having witnessed the collapse of an era. The Rat Pack wasn't fading anymore. It was gone. What remained were two aging men walking away from a grave. No longer legends, just survivors. Dean never spoke publicly again after that day. No interviews. bone, no statements, no comeback rumors. When people asked Frank how Dean was doing, Frank would pause and say, "He's breathing." That's about it. The man who once filled rooms with laughter now lived quietly, shrinking further into himself, the silence growing heavier each year. Those who were there that day never forgot it, not because a celebrity cried, but because they saw something rarer than talent or fame. They saw the cost of a life lived at full volume. They saw what happens when the music stops, and there's no one left backstage waiting for you. At Sammy Davis Jr.'s grave, Dean Martin didn't just say goodbye to a friend. He said goodbye to the last version of himself that still believed the story had a happy ending. But you left, Sam. You left me, and I don't know how to do this without you. The words barely made it out of Dean Martin's mouth before his voice collapsed under their weight. People closest to the grave began to cry openly. Frank Sinatra stepped forward, tears streaming down his face, his own composure gone. Dean's shoulders started to shake. His hands trembled as he reached out and gripped the edge of the grave like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You were my right arm, Sam," he said, his voice breaking apart. "When my boy died, I lost my heart. And now you're gone too, and I'm half a man now. I'm nothing." And then it happened. Not a dramatic fall, not a faint for the cameras, but something far worse. Dean Martin shattered. His knees buckled, his strength vanished, and Frank, along with two others, rushed forward to hold him up. The man who had stood unshaken on every stage in America for half a century was sobbing uncontrollably. Deep, animal sobs pulled from a place of pain most people never see. "I can't do this," Dean cried. I can't lose anyone else. I can't." Frank wrapped his arms around him, holding him tight, his own face wet with tears. I know, Frank whispered. "I know. But you're not alone." Hiri. I'm still here." But Dean wasn't hearing him. He was drowning. Drowning in the loss of his son. Drowning in the loss of his brother. Drowning in the slow death of everything that once gave his life meaning. His voice, his career, his purpose, his family. And now Sammy. The man who could still make him laugh when nothing else could. The man who stood beside him when the lights were brightest and the nights were darkest. For 50 years, Dean Martin had been the king of cool. The man who never cracked. The man who turned pain into charm and sorrow into song. The man who could walk through chaos with a martini and a smile. But on May 18th, 1990, that mask finally fell away. And the world saw the truth. Dean Martin was human. He loved deeply. He hurt profoundly. And he had been carrying more grief than anyone ever realized. As Frank and the others guided him back toward the car, cameras flashed, freezing the moments forever. The headlines the next day were brutal in their simplicity. Dean Martin breaks down at Sammy Davis Jr.'s funeral. But those who were there knew the photos lied. They couldn't capture the sound of his sobs. They couldn't capture the way his body shook. They couldn't capture how Frank held him, not like a colleague, not like a fellow star, but like a father holding a broken son. Dean Martin never recovered from that day. He lived another 5 years. But the man who emerged from Sammy's funeral was quieter, smaller, more distant. He withdrew even further from the world. He stopped answering the phone. He stopped letting people in. He had lost too much, and the fear of losing anything else became unbearable. On December 25th, 1995, Dean Martin died in his sleep at the age of 70. The official cause was acute respiratory failure, but Everyone who truly knew him understood the real cause. Dean Martin died of a broken heart. He had been dying slowly. Since the day his son's plane went down, Sammy's death had simply finished what grief had already started. At Dean's funeral, Frank Sinatra was too ill to attend, but a message from him was read aloud. Dean Martin was the coolest man I ever knew, but he was also the most loving, the most loyal, the most human. He taught me that it's okay to cry. It's okay to break, because that's what makes us real. Rest easy, Dino. You're with Sammy now. I'll see you both soon. Frank Sinatra died 3 years later, in 1998. And with him, the Rat Pack era officially ended. But the story of the day the King of Cool cried still lives on, because it tells us something we often forget. Even the strongest people break. Even the coolest men feel unbearable heat. Even legends bleed. Dean Martin spent his life making the world smile. He gave joy to millions. But in the end, he was just a man. A father who lost his son. A brother who lost his family. A performer who lost his voice. And when he finally allowed the world to see his pain, he gave us something more valuable than any song he ever sang. He gave us permission to be human, to grieve, to fall apart, because even kings cry, and sometimes that is the bravest thing of all.